So, as we've seen, in order to defend against the new explosive shells fired by naval cannons, it became necessary, as a sort of technological solution, to find better protection for wooden ships. That's why they decided to cover them with armor plating, so these powerful projectiles, perfected by Pake's hands, couldn't penetrate them. But at first, there were obviously some problems, because the armor made the ship heavier. We've already seen that. Fortunately, ships already had engines, but those engines were still primitive and had limited power. So making these ships even heavier meant making them really slow. So there was a bit of how can I put it? You had to choose between a well-defended, well-protected, and well-armed ship or a faster ship. This was the big dilemma that naval experts from all the major world powers had to resolve. France was the first to use ironclads in the Crimean War, but in reality, they were more like armored boats. In other words, they were literally barges covered with metal plates and equipped with cannons, and they even had an engine. But as I mentioned, because they were heavy and hard to maneuver, these ships often had to be towed by other vessels and positioned in front of, let's say, the Russian coastal defenses. From there, they had only limited mobility using their own engines. And from there, they could bombard the enemy on land. But clearly, they weren't real ships, since they still had to be towed. So, a French engineer named Desormes had a pretty simple, yet brilliant idea. Why armor the entire ship? After all, where did the hits usually land? On the sides. So he decided to, or at least to protect only the two sides of the ship with armor. So the deck wasn't. It was still made of wood. The stern and the bow were still wood, and even more so the hull underneath. This made the ship a bit lighter, so a bit faster. And for the moment, it seemed like the best solution. In fact, in the 1850s, just after the Crimean War, the French built the Gloire and the British built the Warrior. These were the first two prototypes of armored ships, even if not fully armored, in the world. But it was obvious that the solution all the scientists were aiming for was, in short, to have a fully armored ship, but at the same time one that had good speed, and to try to find further solutions that could improve on this experiment. But in the meantime, as I was saying, it's a constant technological race. So when armored ships started to spread, even the Italian Navy, during the Third War of Independence in 1866, had its own armored ships, at least partially, the Re d'Italia and the Palestro. And there were already people coming up with solutions to break through these armored ships. And one solution was the use of rifled cannons. Rifled cannons had already been invented by our General Cavalli from Piedmont, who had experimented with a breech-loading rifled cannon. What were rifled cannons? Well, they had spiral grooves inside the barrel. And what did these grooves do? Well, in regular smoothbore cannons, the ball would roll freely inside the barrel and then shoot out, sometimes following rather imprecise trajectories because of the last bounce it made in the barrel, and there was a significant loss of gas from the explosion. Now, with these rifled cannons, the projectile was no longer round but had an ogival, pointed shape, making it more aerodynamic. It would spin inside the barrel, stabilizing its trajectory, and it was designed to fit perfectly. Actually, its caliber was even slightly larger than the barrel, so that no gas could escape. This way, it used all the power of the detonation, making it more accurate, with greater penetrating power and a longer range. So, it was definitely an important invention. By the way, rifling was already known when it came to muskets, but with cannons, it seems it had been more difficult to implement until then, probably because there were other issues related to technology and metalworking with how can I put it, these were heavier, larger objects that also had to withstand much higher pressures compared to a musket. Now, some of you might ask, but couldn't an ogive-shaped projectile be used even with a smoothbore cannon? No, a smoothbore cannon could only fire spherical balls, precisely because the ball inside, first of all, had limited adherence, and then, when it exited the barrel, the ball, like any object in the world, was subject not only to the force of the explosion's push, but also to gravity. So it tended to, how can I put it, spit on itself. So this kind of rotation was fine for a sphere, which is symmetrical on all sides. And so, it doesn't really change the trajectory it has already taken. But if it had been an ogival bullet, so not symmetrical, the bullet would have rotated toward the side where the center of mass was heavier, and as a result, the tip would have, how can I say, pointed downward, and the base would have hit the target instead. So clearly, that's something you definitely didn't want to happen. The tip was supposed to hit the target with this sort of wedge shape that allowed for greater penetration. It could even have an explosive charge inside, so it would create the intended impact and damage. With rifled cannons, this became possible, so they started experimenting with armor-piercing projectiles capable of penetrating these armors. Cavalli's invention was initially set aside because he was too far ahead of his time. He had even invented a breech-loading cannon and a rifled one. However, the breech closure wasn't perfect when he used it, so some of the gases escaped, they leaked out, and as a result, the outcome wasn't excellent. But over the years, as we'll see, in America, right during the Civil War, there were inventors who perfected these rifled cannons, both for coastal artillery and also for field artillery. We'll see that on the Union side there was Parrott, and on the Confederate side there was John Brooke. So little by little this weapon designed to pierce armor would gradually develop during the war. But we'll get to that step by step. And then another weapon was the underwater threat, the threat of torpedoes, of underwater mines, which the Russians had already used back in the Crimean War. These were contact mines, meaning they were triggered by a small striker when they hit a passing ship on the surface. But even these still needed a lot of improvement, and the Southerners would get there later during the Civil War. This is just to point out that the ironclad ship, or at least the partially armored ship, at the start of the Civil War was definitely a cutting-edge solution, but there would soon be even further innovations in a very short time. So, what was the situation of the American Navy at the outbreak of the war? Union Navy, well, they had 6 frigates, steam frigates, so with engines, and about 20 corvettes, also with engines. There were no more ships of the line, precisely because, as I mentioned earlier, the engines available at the time had low power. So, even though they had propellers, which gave them greater propulsion capability and required less power to move the ship, you still couldn't go overboard with the weight. So the ships of the line were set aside, and smaller classes of ships were used instead, specifically frigates and corvettes. Frigates used to be like the cavalry of the sea, while ships of the line were the infantry, the heavy, powerful ones that fired all together in a line. The frigate moved quickly and served escort functions. From the mid-1800s onward, the frigate, now powered by engines, began to take on the role that the ship of the line had during the age of sail, while the corvette took on the role that the frigate had in Nelson's time. So, it had about 30 modern ships, and then another 40 or 50 old-style ships of the line. Obviously, as you can imagine, it takes time to, let's say, replace the old models. So, in any case, the sailing ships were still operational and were still being used by the American Navy. It's interesting to note, however, that the United States' strategy throughout the 19th century was also to defend its coasts not only with its navy, which was still the first line of defense against invasions, but also with coastal forts. In fact, the Americans had been badly burned during the War of 1812 to 1815 with England. It was a strange war that broke out due to disputes over commercial neutrality, and also, how can I put it, because the British would seize sailors aboard American ships, claiming they were British citizens, and then conscripting them into their navy. In short, this war revealed the vulnerability of the United States in the face of the greatest naval power of the time. And in fact, the British managed to carry out major raids in the Chesapeake Bay and even reached Washington, where they looted the city, burned the Capitol, and burned the White House, which at the time wasn't yet called the White House. It would be called that after this fire, precisely because of the whitewash, the paint that was applied to cover the burn marks. So, throughout the 1800s, the Americans would always be studying solutions for maritime defense, always keeping in mind the possibility of another invasion by England. England was the enemy to fear. England was still the nation that probably hadn't yet come to terms with the independence of the American colonies, its American colonies, and it was expected at any moment that it might take advantage of any situation to try to reconquer its old possessions. And so, from 1817 up until even the eve of the American Civil War, a project was started called the Third System of Coastal Fortifications, because in the previous years, let's say the late 1700s and early 1800s, there had been 2 other projects, but they had built forts that weren't exactly state-of-the-art. So, this third project was more impressive, both in terms of funds allocated and forts built, most of which were constructed in the South. They were meant to protect anchorages, important ports, and estuaries of navigable rivers, basically placed in key positions. Obviously, in the event of an invasion, they weren't the ultimate solution, but they served as an initial line of resistance for Americans. They also acted as a deterrent for anyone who might have had bad intentions. The people in charge of this, the design of this third system, which basically started from a base project and then was modified depending on the location of the fort, were the French engineer Simon Bernard and the American engineer Totten. They developed, let's say, a pentagonal or hexagonal fort design to minimize blind spots that couldn't be covered by artillery. The distinctive feature of these forts was the presence of casemates. Casemates, as you might know, are a kind of masonry cover for cannons with an embrasure, allowing the crew to operate without being exposed. So, Totten in particular designed forts whose walls were made up of large corridors with all these casemates, each with their own cannons and embrasures. There were even multiple levels of casemates, 1, 2, even 3 stories, and on top of that, there were even cannons placed above. There were additional cannons on the rampart, basically on the main parapet, mounted in barbette, that is, out in the open. So you could even have up to 3 rows of cannons in different configurations. It's called in barbette because the cannon is placed out in the open, right on the main perimeter wall. And when these cannons fired, their shots would kind of shave the parapet, this main wall. So this was an innovative feature introduced by the Americans. But clearly these forts also had their flaws. First of all, they didn't have. They were designed to defend the coasts, so almost all of their defenses, the protected artillery, faced the sea, pointed toward the sea, while they had no defenses on the landward side. That's why almost all the coastal forts were easily captured, taken by the Confederates after the secession. Additionally, the perimeter walls were actually made up of casemates. So they weren't solid walls, but hollow walls with large supporting arches. However, they were empty to allow for the placement of cannons. This made them very vulnerable to the new artillery, especially rifled cannons, and we'll see the results later during the American Civil War, which would be truly devastating for these coastal forts. Another weakness was also the weaponry. Initially, they were equipped with the famous columbiads, which were kind of the American answer to what pigs' hens had developed. That is, they were large columbiad cannons that also evoked a very patriotic feeling, of the District of Columbia. An American cannon. They had a shape almost like a bottle and were smoothbore, so they didn't yet have the innovation of rifle barrels, and they fired gigantic balls, both solid shot and explosive shells. And what was their main characteristic? Even though they had long barrels, they were able to fire in a high arc, almost like a mortar, and they looked more like howitzers. In fact, we often see them not aimed straight ahead, but slightly tilted upward. These devices, these artillery pieces. So why were they like that? Because this way, they could fire shots that would land right in the middle of a ship's deck, causing a lot of damage, especially to the crew, by exploding in the middle of the deck. Sometimes, they would even pierce the deck and get inside the ship where the crew was working on the cannons. In short, they really caused a lot of damage. And by the way, these Columbiads were further improved in the 1840s by a certain Rodman who, thanks to technological innovations in metal casting, managed to build cannons with an even larger caliber that could fire solid shots weighing almost half a ton. It's really something gigantic. In fact, it took quite a bit of time to load these gigantic cannons. You had to use a pulley to lift the projectile up to the height of the barrel and drop it in. But when they fired, if they hit you, whether you were a wooden ship or an invading vessel, you were in serious trouble. The problem, as I was saying, was that these weapons soon became obsolete because their range was still limited. In fact, these forts often had additional coastal batteries nearby to better cover the surrounding area, since the limited range of these Columbiads often wasn't enough to hit a potential enemy, maybe one who had landed in a port, an anchorage nearby, or somewhere else in the bay. Exactly. Then I also remember Dahlgren, another naval officer who would become important, a key commander in the Union Navy. He too had perfected large cannons, still smoothbore, but transportable on ships, and these definitely produced powerful fire as well, at least at close range. So we see that while the Pake's Hands and Pake's Hands cannons could be transported on ships, the Americans adopted a similar solution with Rodman's Columbiads, but those were exclusively land-based cannons, meant for fortresses. They couldn't be put on ships because of their weight, but Dahlgren somehow managed to develop cannons that could be mounted on ships and could also fire shells, basically like Pake's Hands cannons. So, this was more or less the situation at the start of the Civil War, right? A navy that was definitely not highly developed. There weren't any ironclads. There were these coastal forts, but it was still a good navy. A navy that, among other things, was engaged in various theaters of operation in the Mediterranean and in the seas of China against piracy. So, paradoxically, when the Civil War broke out, when the Confederates declared secession, well, the United States Navy, the Union Navy, had only a few ships available to enforce the naval blockade that the Union government immediately decided on. They had just a handful of ships, some frigates, and, as we'll see, over time, little by little, all the other ships that were scattered around the world would return to base, and this whole blockade operation would get better organized. But we'll get into that more later. I just want to specify one last thing before wrapping up this, let's say, this introductory lesson, the Southern sailors. There were many Southern officers in the U.S. Navy, but unlike the Army officers, only half of them joined the new Confederate States when secession happened. The other half, or actually maybe even more than half, remained loyal to the Union. Why? Because these were people who were used to traveling all over the world. They were far from home, sometimes for years, so their sense of belonging was no longer tied to their land or their home state. Their sense of belonging was to the Navy, to the Stars and Stripes, and often they had been living for many years in the North, where the main naval bases and shipyards were located, so they felt less connected to Southern culture. Those few, Basically, the half of those officers who joined the Confederacy actually caused, in quotes, a big problem for the Confederacy when they resigned from the Union Navy. In fact, they were all commanders, ship officers, and because of their strong sense of honor, before resigning, they returned their ships to Union ports and only then resigned. After that, let's say on foot, they made themselves available to the Confederate government. Others would have taken the ships to southern ports so they could be used, also because, as I say, in war everything is allowed, right? And so, giving ships to the enemy, who already had plenty and could build just as many more. Meanwhile, your own country doesn't even have a paper boat. That seems foolish to me. But the Southerners, even though they had many flaws, had a strong sense of honor and preferred to hand the ships over to their rightful owner, which was the United States. They didn't really consider the fact that those ships had been paid for by all taxpayers, including those from the South. So maybe it would have been fair for the secessionists to keep some of them too. But these, in short, are just speculations. Let's see. By the way, I should mention that the sailors all remained Unionists, or almost all did. So maybe, if the Southern captain wanted to take the ship to Charleston, it wasn't guaranteed that the Unionist sailors would follow his orders. So, in short, this is kind of the technological situation and the state of the Union Navy right before the outbreak of hostilities. We'll take a look at the solutions Lincoln will adopt with his secretary Gideon Welles, who was anything but a naval expert. He had this really long beard that made him look a bit like Neptune, but he knew almost nothing. And in fact, he relied especially on Gustavo Veza Fox for organization and for developing a wartime strategy, an ex-naval officer who had also fought in Mexico, and a former merchant navy officer who would give Welles some crucial advice. As we'll see, he really became one of the key architects of the Union victory at sea as well. The Confederate Navy, well, started from scratch. There was this secretary meaning minister, named Stephen Mallory, who had actually been a senator on a committee that had started a project to modernize the pre-war American Navy. But in fact, he had also been a senator in Congress in Washington for many years. So when he was appointed Secretary of the Navy, he was definitely the most qualified person because he had already dealt with issues related to ships and defense. However, the problem was that there was very little money and just as few resources and men. In fact, there were no resources at all. However, he was very clever and had some smart officers at his disposal, like Brooke, as I mentioned earlier, but there were others as well. We'll see, little by little, the solutions these Confederate pioneers came up with. I say pioneers because, in the end, starting from scratch could actually be an advantage with all these new technologies that had emerged. In fact, there wasn't a layer of officers or traditions to uphold. It was all new, so innovations could be implemented quickly, and we'll see that. I'll finish by recommending a few readings for anyone interested in this topic. First of all, there's Big Bad Ironclad, which is a comic from the Nathan Hale series. I found it on Amazon. It's a comic drawn in a kind of simple style, almost elementary characters, but it tells the story very well and is historically accurate, covering the events of naval warfare during the Civil War. It's in English, but it's easy to understand. Then there's this book, which is hard to find, by Captain Michel Cosentino. It's a supplement to the Maritime magazine and covers all the events of the Naval War. What's really nice is that inside there are diagrams and sheets with drawings of the main ships, both Union and Confederate. There are also illustrations and maps. It's a small volume, but very well made, by someone who clearly knows a lot about naval matters. And I'll finish with what I think is the masterpiece, The Sailors of the South by Luragi, a book that's practically impossible to find. It was published only once, I think in '93, and then never reprinted. Let's hope someone reprints it sooner or later. Maybe, by asking the rights from the heirs of the great professor. It's truly a comprehensive book. Even the Americans haven't written anything so precise and well documented. In fact, it even won several awards in the United States. If you manage to find it, even in a library, read it. It's a bit big, but it's very well written in Professor Luragi's style. It's actually a very easy read. That's it for now. I'll wrap up here. This is a pilot episode, and in the coming weeks, between one commitment and another, I'll try to continue telling the story of the navies during the American Civil War. Goodbye.